Welcome and thank you for taking the time to listen to our presentation today. My name is Tony Presta and I am your superintendent. Deputy Superintendent Karine Baca and I are excited to share with you a tool we have created in order to help us ensure that we are making equitable decisions in our school district. We will describe some of our work and will review the Equity Lens tool. And then we ask that you take some time to reflect and fill out a feedback form for us. We will take your thoughts into consideration when finalizing our Equity Lens tool. We start by highlighting our district demographics and pay special attention to the racial makeup of our student body and their outcomes. As you can see, of our nearly 4,000 students, 1.3% are African American, 0.2% are American Indian, 14.7% are Asian, 28.2% are Filipino, 32% are Hispanic, 0.7% are Pacific Islander, 7.4% identify as two or more races, and 15.2% are white. Before we provide an overview of our equity lens, it's important to begin by defining what we mean by equity. Equity means giving students what they need when they need it. Everyone gets what they need, taking into account the barriers, circumstances, and conditions they experience. That's very different from equality, where everyone gets the same, regardless of whether it's needed or right for them. I will read our equity statement, which was adopted by our board in 2021 and guides our work. The Jefferson Union High School District uses our educational systems to right current and historical inequities by examining and understanding how our decision-making reinforces or interrupts injustice. We embrace inclusion, value diversity, and educate ourselves in order to confront and dismantle systemic inequities to bring about a more just society. JUHSD commits to engaging, educating, and empowering all students with an intentional focus on those underserved, inadequately served, or disenfranchised by educational institutions and systems, eliminating disparities in educational outcomes. Our focus on equity is highlighted in our LCAP goal number 3. The LCAP is our Local Control Accountability Plan, and it has many components. Our equity goal has 4 parts: anti-racism education and training, ethnic studies, grading practices, and LGBTQ+ systems of supports. Today's presentation will focus on anti-racism education and training. We partner with Courageous Conversation and follow their protocol to support the difficult work of achieving racial equity. You will see that the protocol includes a compass to center ourselves when engaging in this work, along with 4 agreements that we make with ourselves and others. The agreements are to stay engaged, speak our truth, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. And finally, the protocol acknowledges that 6 conditions must be present when discussing race. Our work with Courageous Conversation began with our District Equity Leadership Team, or DELT. This team includes myself, the Deputy and Associate Superintendents, and Director of Human Resources. We began working with Courageous Conversation in 2021, along with all of our district-level administrators. This year, we broadened our work to create LEADS, a Leadership for Racial Equity Working Group. This group consists of all site and district administrators. We also trained every staff member this year in the basics of Courageous Conversation protocol. In the fall, we will begin with our site equity teams, or E-teams. They will help design and deliver professional development that will support school-wide equity transformation. And finally, we will expand to include SOAR, which stands for Students Organized Against Racism. Now that we have given a brief overview of our equity work, we will move to the reason we are presenting to you and ask for your feedback. Our DELT or District Equity Leadership Team has created a draft equity lens tool, and we would like feedback from our JUHSD community, including students, staff, families, our school board, and more. An equity lens is a set of questions we ask ourselves to ground our decision making in equity when we plan, develop, or evaluate a policy, program, or practice. It is our strong belief that using an equity lens tool will help us to dismantle inequitable practices in our schools and district and support us in creating new ways of being that ensure all of our students have what they need when they need it. Deputy Superintendent Baca will now describe our draft equity lens tool.
Hello, my name is Corinne Baca, Deputy Superintendent of Educational Services. In the next few slides, I will be going over the draft of Equity Lens tool, and our hope is to get feedback from you on how we can improve this tool and its use. On the left-hand side is the purpose statement of the Equity Lens tool. The first paragraph states what the tool is. The second paragraph calls out our duty to identify patterns of inequity and dismantle the structural barriers, systemic inequities, and disparities in educational outcomes. Lastly, the third paragraph reminds us to isolate the impact of race as we answer these 15 questions. We are intentionally calling out race as it has been one of the strongest and most consistent predictors of disproportionate outcomes. We will look at these questions in more depth when I show the example, but I would like to point out that these sets of questions are divided into 5 sections. Number 1, purpose and assumptions. Number 2, inclusion and representation. Number 3, impact and outcomes. Number 4, process and communication. And number 5, evaluation and feedback. I will not read over these terms, but we have included them in the presentation so that you can reference these definitions when reviewing the Equity Lens tool. Before we look at these questions in more detail, let's review when and/or how to use this tool. First, you identify a policy, program, or practice where a decision has to be made. Then reflect on the issue and bring it to a group of people that will help make the decision. Go through each of the questions listed on the Equity Lens tool and have a group dialogue. Use the Equity Lens worksheet linked on this slide as a document to jot down thoughts, ideas, concerns, etc. Sometimes you may need to seek additional information, so non-closure is normal. Based on the data gathering and our feedback, make an informed decision and communicate this decision, implement, monitor, and evaluate. Now let's look at the tool through a sample scenario that happened a few years ago. About 1 month after the COVID shutdown, remote learning for the rest of the year became a reality. Teachers were getting ready to submit the second progress report for the spring semester when staff members began to talk and think about how grades would be assigned, taking into account that some students did not have access to the resources needed to be successful in remote learning. It was suggested that we develop a hybrid grading system where students could earn an A, B, C, pass, or no mark. We started asking, what is the policy, program, or practice being examined? We looked into revising the board policy on grading and adopt a hybrid grading policy. Then, we looked at the assumptions we were bringing into the issue. This was discussed as a group, and assumptions were brought up such as students and families might not have the devices and internet connection needed to fully participate in remote learning. Some students might need to work or take care of siblings, which would take away time from participating. Students of color, students with disabilities, and students learning English are the groups more likely to fail courses. Also, teachers and staff might not be as available to assist students as they have their own families to take care of. So this policy revision made sense. However, some people in the group mentioned that some students might not take school as seriously, knowing that they will automatically pass the class. Some said that this policy is not fair to the students who worked hard all year. And some asked about how this will affect college admissions. The second set of questions considers inclusion and representation. We continue to ask the series of questions about who is included in this conversation, and we listed the groups of people who might be affected and how. We wanted to be sure that we heard from those who were most impacted, so we asked question number 5. Are the people impacted by this decision present? If not, why not? We jotted down ideas and decided that we needed to do outreach, so we talked to those impacted by this decision and gathered input. We discussed whether or not students needed to be part of these conversations, since the intent was to hold students harmless with this policy change, and decided that it was not necessary. The third section of the tool focuses on impact and outcomes. We ask whether this potential policy change reflected the purpose of the Equity Lens tool, and we found that yes, it did. Temporarily amending our grading policy provided what our students needed when they needed it, taking into account the barriers, circumstances, and conditions our students were experiencing. Another important question to ask was what resources were needed to make this happen, and time played a huge factor. The last question in this section is asking for specific ways that this outcome could reduce disparities. We found that it would hold all students harmless, especially our underserved students. The next section focuses on process and communication. We looked at grades from the first progress report and determined which groups of students were more likely to receive a D or an F. This data gathering validated that it was our Hispanic and our African American students that were more likely to fail than the other student groups. After all the discussion and data gathering, we decided to move forward with a decision and recommended the temporary grade change policy to the Board of Trustees. On April 20th, 2020, the Board of Trustees adopted a revision to the board policy, which said, when an emergency situation occurs that prevents students from having access to the supports/resources needed in order to complete their work at home, students will not be negatively impacted or penalized. Therefore, when San Mateo County, the state of California, or the U.S. government declares a state of emergency, the board, with a recommendation from the superintendent or designee, may decide to assign final grades of A, B, C, pass, or no mark. With this change, we made sure that there was clear communication to all of our educational partners, and we were available to answer questions as needed. After this policy change, we were glad to have made this decision to hold students harmless. By not receiving an F, their grade point averages were not affected dramatically for college admissions. The last set of questions on evaluations and feedback ask whether our decision was clearly communicated and accessible. They also ask how the feedback was incorporated into the decision. We took into account the outcomes and impact by looking at the students who receive a grade of P or pass and tracking their progress the following year. We provided extra support to those students by offering tutoring. Lastly, we looked at unintended consequences of this policy change. And one of the consequences was that some students passed classes with gaps in skills. The students in this situation needed to be provided additional support in their next level classes. This pretty much concludes the 15 questions that we asked ourselves as we implemented the pandemic grading policy. Overall, it was the right decision to hold students harmless when access to learning depended on forces beyond their control.
This concludes our overview of the Equity Lens tool. We ask that you take some time to think and process the tool and provide us with feedback to help us improve our equity efforts in JUHSD. Here is a link and a QR code to the feedback survey. Thanks so much.